The Lockheed P38 Lightning racked up an impressive series of firsts. It was the first Lockheed-designed military aircraft to go into series production. It was the first twinned-engine interceptor to serve with the U.S. Army Air Corps. It was the first production fighter powered by the Allison V-1710 inline engine. It was the first modern fighter equipped with a tricycle landing gear. It was the first American plane to use butt-jointed flush riveted external surfaces. It was the first to make extensive use of stainless steel. It was the first fighter to use a bubble canopy right from the start. It was the first fighter with speeds over 400 miles per hour. It was the first U.S. twin-boom fighter to go into production. It was the first U.S. Army Air Force fighter to shoot down a German aircraft. It was the first U.S. Army Air Force fighter to carry out an escort mission to Berlin. It was the first U.S. Army Air Force plane to land in Japan after the country had surrendered. It was the heaviest U.S. single-seat fighter of World War II. It was the only American fighter in production at the time of Pearl Harbor to still be in production at the war's end, and it accounted for more Japanese aircraft destroyed in combat than any other U.S. fighter. Lockheed was invited along with Boeing, Consolidated, Curtiss, Douglas, and Vultee to take part in a U.S. Army Air Corps design competition, X-608, for a twin-engine high-altitude interceptor. The specification called for a maximum speed of at least 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and 290 miles per hour at sea level, an endurance at full throttle of 1 hour at 20,000 feet, and the ability to take off and land over a 50-foot obstacle within 2,200 feet. After studying a lot of different designs, Lockheed settled on a twin-boom design with each boom extending aft of the engine and the pilot sitting in an enclosed cockpit in a central nacelle. Each boom was to house one of the new 1,150 horsepower Allison 12-cylinder liquid-cooled engine with an exhaust-driven turbo supercharger. The central nacelle contained a forward-firing armament of 1 cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns. This armament was quite heavy for its time. One advantage of the twin-boom layout was the possibility of installing the armament in the central nacelle, unhampered by the synchronizing gear and allowing sighting of the parallel streams of fire up to the maximum range of 1,000 yards. Tail surfaces consisted of a fin and rudder at the end of each boom and a horizontal tailplane and elevator between the booms. It was anticipated that the twin fin and rudder tail assembly would increase the effective aspect ratio of the tailplane by the end plane effect, thereby providing stability over a large center of gravity range. At 14,800 pounds, the XP-38 weighed more than a bombed-up Bristol Blenheim, at the time the standard British medium bomber. Fowler flaps were fitted between the ailerons and the booms, and between the booms beneath the trailing edge of the wing center section. On September 20th, 1939, the Army placed an order for 66 P-38 fighters. The P-38 armament was changed to 1 37mm cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns. Armor plate and bulletproof glass was added for pilot protection, and fluorescent instrument lighting was provided for night flying. Reports coming in from the air war in Europe led to the remainder of the initial order for 66 P-38s being completed as P-38D LO. The P-38D differed from the P-38 in having a low-pressure oxygen system, self-sealing fuel tanks, a retractable landing light, and provision for flares. A change in tailplane incidence together with the redistribution of elevator mass balances increased the mechanical advantage of the elevator control, resulting in the elimination of buffeting and facilitating dive recovery. The P38D featured a new low-pressure oxygen system which supplanted the old high-pressure oxygen system of earlier versions. This system became standard on all subsequent production models. Normal fuel capacity remained 210 gallons, but maximum internal fuel was reduced from 410 to 300 gallons. The P38D had a maximum speed of 390 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. An altitude of 20,000 feet could be reached in 8 minutes. Service ceiling was 39,000 feet. The first P-38Ds began to reach the U.S. Army Air Force units in August 1941. For a brief period, the U.S. Army Air Force considered naming the P-38 Atlanta. However, the P-38D and subsequent versions were officially christened Lightning by the U.S. Army Air Force. By the time of Pearl Harbor, there were only 69 P-38 and P-38D fighters on strength. The first major production version for the U.S. Army Air Force was the P-38E LO series. It differed from the D version in having the 37mm cannon with the 15-round magazine replaced by a 20mm cannon with 150 rounds. The P-38E had improved instrumentation and revised hydraulic and electrical systems. It had a revised nose section with double the ammunition capacity of earlier versions. Early in its life, the P-38 earned a reputation as a pilot killer. A terminal velocity dive in a P-38 was believed by many pilots to be a fatal maneuver. It was possible in a high-speed dive to overstress the plane while trying to pull out, and a number of P-38s lost appendages while doing such maneuvers and crashed, usually with fatal results. It was later determined that these problems were the result of the effects of compressibility. Although it was later found that all aircraft had problems when they operated in these speed ranges, the P-38 was a pioneer in high-speed flight and thus got a bad reputation. The P-38L was the final production version of the Lightning and was numerically the most important of all Lightning versions. The 1st Pursuit Group at Selfridge Field, Michigan, was selected to become the first unit to receive P-38s and P-38Ds in 1941. Although these fighters were not yet combat ready, these outfits had the only truly modern fighters then available to the U.S. Army Air Force, and provided West Coast defense at a time that Japanese attacks on the U.S. mainland were believed to be imminent. Even though the defense of the U.S. West Coast initially took priority, plans were made in the spring of 1942 to deploy Lightning squadrons to Britain. This deployment caused logistical problems, since the U-boat menace made shipping across the Atlantic quite risky. However, development by Lockheed of reliable drop tanks for the P38F1LO increased the ferry range from 1,300 to 2,200 miles. This made it possible to ferry the Lightnings to Scotland. On August 14, 1942, a P-38F, flown by 2nd Lieutenant Elza Shaham, shared with a P-40C in the destruction of a Focke-Wulf to obtain the first victory over a Luftwaffe aircraft. The Lightnings were soon in regular combat in the North African theater. The first of these took place on November 19, 1942, when the P-38Fs of the 1st Fighter Group escorted B-17s on a bombing raid on the El Aouinia airfield of Tunis. The 3 P-38 groups contributed a great deal toward the establishment of local air superiority in the area. On April 5, 1943, 26 P-38Fs of the 82nd Fighter Group claimed the destruction of 31 enemy aircraft against the loss of 6 Lightnings. In these air battles, mixed success was obtained. Because of the tactics of the enemy, the Lightnings were forced to fight at lower altitudes of 15,000 feet, and in battles against fighters it was not entirely successful. The twin engines restricted maneuverability to some extent, and the Lightning had a wheel control instead of the conventional stick, which may also have restricted maneuverability. Nevertheless, the Lightning was effective against bombers and had a sensational zoom climb that could rarely be matched. It wreaked great havoc among Rommel's air transport well out to sea, earning for itself the German nickname Der Gabelschwanzteufel, the forked-tailed devil. All Axis forces in the area surrendered on May 13, 1943, due in no small part to the contribution of the Lightning in cutting off Rommel's supply route. The first Lightning-escorted raids on Germany began in 1944 with the raids on aircraft factories in the southern part of that country. In April 1944, the Lightnings escorted bombers in raids on the oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania. Bomb-carrying Lightnings also visited Ploesti on June 10, 1944, when 46 aircraft of the 82nd Fighter Group, each carrying 1,000-pound bombs, paid a visit to the Romano Americana oil refinery under the protective escort of 48 P-38s of the 1st Fighter Group. On that raid, good bombing and strafing results were obtained, but in fighter actions against the Luftwaffe, 22 P-38s were lost against 23 enemy aircraft claimed destroyed. The 3 Lightning groups also took part in the August 1944 Allied landings in southern France. After that, they returned to providing fighter escort for bombers operating against strategic targets. By the end of the war, 28 of these Lightning pilots had made ace. The Lightnings played a major role in supporting the D-Day invasion of France in June of 1944. 2 months earlier, they had begun attacking German positions in Normandy in preparation for the landings. Once the troops had landed by air and sea, the P-38s provided close air support. This would be a role that would continue throughout the rest of the war. In air combat over Germany, the Lightning was generally outclassed by the more maneuverable FW-190 and the later marks of the Bf-109, especially at medium and low altitudes. However, the Lightning had a much faster top speed, a higher rate of climb and operational ceiling, and was much better armed. Once pilots had perfected fighting tactics which suited the Lightning's unique characteristics, they had better success. The usual tactics was for the P-38 to climb to a high altitude, then dive down on the enemy, attacking him with a burst of firepower, and then zoom back up out of harm's way. The later versions of the P-38 were equipped with maneuvering flaps, and when the pilots learned how to use these flaps properly, the P-38 could hold its own when maneuvering against German fighters, often being able to turn inside their FW-190 and Bf-109 opponents. The large size of the P-38 was both an advantage and a disadvantage in combat. The P-38 was quite large for a fighter, and Luftwaffe pilots could usually spot the Lockheed fighter at much larger distances than they could Allied single-engine fighters, which were appreciably smaller. In addition, the twin-boomed configuration of the P-38 made it instantly recognizable to the enemy. However, this ease of recognition was not always a disadvantage. P-38s would often feel free to pursue Luftwaffe fighters right through Allied bomber formations with little fear of receiving friendly fire on the gunners. The Allison engines of the Lightnings proved to be somewhat temperamental, with engine failures actually causing more problems than enemy action. It is estimated that every Lightning in England changed its engines at least once. Nevertheless, the ability of the Lightning to return home on one engine was exceptional and saved the life of the pilot of many a wounded Lightning. Experienced pilots could handle the Lightning satisfactorily at high altitude, but too many of the 8th Air Force pilots did not have the training or experience to equip them for flying this temperamentally powered aircraft in combat. Earlier Lightnings had problems with high-speed dives. When the airspeed reached a sufficiently high value, the controls would suddenly lock up, and the Lightning would tuck its nose down, making recovery from the dive difficult. In the worst case, the wings of the Lightning could be ripped off if the speed got too high. This problem caused the Lightning often to be unable to follow its Luftwaffe opponents in a dive, causing many of the enemy to be able to escape unscathed. The problem was eventually traced to the formation of a shock wave over the wing as the Lightning reached transonic speeds, this shock wave causing the elevator to lose much of its effectiveness. The P38J version of the Lightning cured many of the ills that had been suffered by the earlier versions of the Lockheed fighter, producing a truly world-class fighter which could mix it up with virtually any other fighter in the world. The Lightning was ideally suited for the Pacific theater. It possessed a performance markedly superior to that of its Japanese opponents. It possessed a range significantly better than that of the P-39s, P-40s, and P-47s available in 1942 in the Southwest Pacific, and its twin engines offered an additional safety factor when operating over long stretches of water and jungle. The Lightnings proved to be extremely rugged and could take a lot of battle damage and still keep flying. Missions lasting 9, 10, or even 12 hours became routine, and many wounded Lightnings were able to limp home on only one engine. The maneuverability of the Lightning was inferior to that of its nimble Japanese opponents, but by the use of appropriate tactics, for example, the avoidance of dogfighting at low altitudes and the use of fast-diving attacks, enabled the P-38 squadrons in New Guinea and the Solomons to achieve impressive results. When compared with the Zero, the Lightning came off badly in terms of speed and maneuverability at medium and low altitudes, but had a far higher top speed, rate of climb, and operational ceiling, and was much better armed. When the P-38 tried to outturn a Zero at low altitudes, it usually ended up second best. However, when the unique attributes of the Lightning were used to best effect, the results were devastating. The best tactic was for the Lightnings to loiter at high altitudes and then dive down on the Zero formations in a blaze of concentrated firepower, using the Lightning's impressive climbing rate to zoom back out of harm's way. If this did not work, the wise Lightning pilot would then use his superior speed to make good his escape. April 1943. In one of the most important missions of the war in the Pacific, P-38 pilots ambushed the plane of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet of the Japanese Navy. They reached their target on schedule just as Yamamoto's flight was coming in. In the ensuing battle, 2 bomber transports and at least 5 Japanese fighters were destroyed at the cost of 1 P-38. Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr. was credited with downing the aircraft in which Admiral Yamamoto had been flying. By the end of the Pacific War, P-38s were flying from bases on Ie Shima and in the Philippines on sorties ranging from as far as Formosa, Korea, and the Ryukyus. They are credited with the destruction of more Japanese aircraft than any other type of U.S. fighter. On August 25, 1945, a pair of P-38s piloted by Colonel Clay Tice and his wingmen were the first American aircraft to land in Japan after the surrender on August 15th. They later claimed that this unauthorized landing was due to engine difficulties, a somewhat suspect explanation. Nevertheless, this was a fitting recognition for an aircraft which had contributed so much to victory.
The P40 Warhawk was the best-known Curtiss-Wright airplane of World War II. It was also one of the most controversial fighters of the war. It was vilified by many as being too slow, lacking in maneuverability, having too low a climbing rate, and being largely obsolescent by contemporary world standards, even before it was placed in production. The inadequacies of the P-40s were even the subject of a congressional investigation. It gets regularly included on lists of the worst combat aircraft of World War II. All of these criticisms certainly had some degree of validity, but it is also true that the P-40 served its country well during the first year of the war in the Pacific, when very little else was available. Along with the P-39 Air Cobra, the P-40 was the only American fighter available in quantity to confront the Japanese advance during the first year of the Pacific War. It helped stem the speed of the Japanese advance until more modern types could be made available in quantity. The P-40 had no serious vices and was a pleasant aircraft to fly, and when flown by an experienced pilot who was fully aware of its strengths and weaknesses, was able to give a good account of itself in aerial combat. The P-40 continued in production long after later types were readily available, the numbers manufactured reaching the third highest total of American World War II fighters, after the Republic P-47 and the North American P-51. The P-40 was obsolete by European standards even before the first prototype flew, and it never did catch up. Its initial inadequacies in the form of low firepower and lack of self-sealing fuel tanks or armor were a reflection of mid-30s U.S. Army Air Corps requirements, which were outmoded. The P-40 had been developed as basically a low-altitude close support fighter under mid-1930s U.S. tactical concepts, which envisaged more need for low-level ground support operations than for high-altitude interceptions. The military doctrine of the ascendancy of bombardment over pursuit was dominant in 1937 when the P-40 first appeared. This doctrine assumed that the prospect of high-altitude enemy air attack on the USA was extremely remote, with coastal defense and ground attack and the defense of U.S. territory being seen as the main tasks for any future fighter aircraft. Low-altitude performance and rugged construction received priority over high-altitude capabilities. The origin of the P-40 can be traced back to the Curtiss P-36 fighter, which was powered by a radial air-cooled engine. Realizing that the radial-engined P-36A was at the limit of its development, Curtiss designer Donovan Berlin got U.S. Army Air Corps permission in July 1937 to install an 1,150 horsepower Allison V1710-19 liquid-cooled engine with integral supercharging. This project was given the company designation of Model 75P, and the U.S. Army Air Corps gave the project a new fighter designation, XP-40. It flew for the first time on October 14, 1938, with Edward Elliott at the controls. Armament was 2.50-inch machine guns located in the upper fuselage deck and synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, standard armament for U.S. pursuit aircraft at the time. Wing racks could be fitted for 6 20-pound bombs. A small oil cooler was located beneath the pointed nose. The air intake for the single-stage supercharger was mounted on top of the engine cowling between the two machine guns, but during tests it was replaced by a long cowled intake duct, which became characteristic of all the early P-40 production models. Initially, the coolant radiator was placed under the fuselage aft of the wing, but it was gradually moved forward until it finally ended up located underneath the extreme nose. The radiator intake was redesigned to include an oil cooler and 2 coolers for the ethylene glycol engine coolant. The initial XP-40 had a single exhaust port on each side of the fuselage, but in its final form, it had 6 separate exhaust ports on each side. The initial XP-40 had inherited from the P-36 a set of main wheel fairing plates, which covered the main wheels when they retracted into their wing wells. But these were eventually deleted and replaced by 2 small doors which closed over the wheel struts upon retraction. maximum speed of the XP40 was 342 miles per hour at 12,200 feet at a gross weight of 6,260 pounds. This was faster than the Hawker Hurricane, but slower than the Spitfire or the Bf-109E. Empty weight was 5,417 pounds, and fully loaded weight was 6,870 pounds. Range was 460 miles at 299 miles per hour with 100 gallons of fuel. With 159 gallons of fuel at 200 miles per hour, a range of 1,180 miles was claimed, almost twice that of the contemporary Hurricane Spitfire and Bf-109E. Wingspan was 37 feet 4 inches. Wing area was 236 square feet. Length was 31 feet 1 inch, and height was 12 feet 4 inches. The wingspan and wing area remained the same throughout the entire history of the P-40 production run. In the late 1930s, the U.S. Army Air Corps was planning to expand its force, and on April 26, 1939, the Army adopted a conservative approach and ordered 524 production versions under the designation P-40, Curtiss Model 81. At that time, it was the largest ever production order for a U.S. fighter and dwarfed the service test orders placed that same day for YP-38 and YP-39 fighters. The P-40 was similar to the final XP-40 configuration, except for 1,040 horsepower V1710-33 C-15 engines and provisions for the mounting of one .30-inch machine gun in each wing. Flush riveting was used to reduce drag. Armor, bulletproof windshields, and leak-proof fuel tanks were added in service. The P-40 was a relatively clean design and was unusual for the time in having a fully retractable tailwheel. The P-40 lacked such things as armor for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a bulletproof windshield, so it was not considered as being suitable for combat. On October 22, 1942, the P-40s still in U.S. Army Air Force service were ordered restricted from combat duty and were redesignated RP-40. At a very early stage, the Curtiss P-40 attracted the attention of foreign air forces. On May 10, 1939, the French ordered 140 export versions of the P-40 for the Armée de l'Air. These aircraft were designated Hawk 81A1 by the manufacturer. The Hawk 81A1s were identical to the US P-40, except that they had French instruments and equipment and were equipped with reverse movement French fashion throttles. The first of the French-ordered H-81A1s flew on June 6, 1940, and a few were actually completed with French markings. However, before any of their H-81A1s could be delivered, France surrendered. Britain agreed to take over the entirety of the French order and gave the H-81A the name Tomahawk I in RAF service. The U.S. Army Air Corps had agreed to defer deliveries of their P-40s so that the Tomahawk could be supplied to Britain as soon as possible. The first Tomahawk reached England in September of 1940. The two .5-inch machine guns in the nose were retained, but they were supplemented by 4 wing-mounted .303-inch Browning machine guns in place of the 7.5mm FN Brownings specified by the French. Such was the urgency of their delivery to Britain that many of the 140 machines still had French instruments and bore cockpit lettering in French when they arrived. However, Britain quickly concluded that these planes were not suitable for combat, since they lacked armor protection for the pilot, armor glass windshields, or self-sealing fuel tanks. Nevertheless, since a German invasion was feared to be imminent, they were actually issued to several operational squadrons. However, the Hun never invaded England, and so the Tomahawks were used only for training roles within Britain. Overseas, the first Desert Air Force squadron to be equipped with Tomahawks was number 112, which exchanged its Gloucester Gladiators for the Curtiss fighter. Number 112 Squadron became famous for its shark's tooth insignia on the engine cowling, and this scheme was later adopted by the American Volunteer Group in China. The Tomahawk IIA, model H-81A2, was equivalent to the US P-40B. It had protective armor and externally covered self-sealing tanks. 110 were built for the RAF under a direct purchase contract. It carried two .30-inch machine guns in the wings, in addition to the two .50-inch guns in the fuselage. A British radio was fitted. After the German invasion of the USSR in June 1941, 195 Tomahawk IIBs were shipped to the USSR, some from the USA, others selected from the reserve force based in the United Kingdom. These Russian Tomahawks went into action on the Moscow and Leningrad fronts in October 1941 and were the first US-built planes to be used by the Russians in the new battle area. An unspecified number of Tomahawk IIBs were sent to bolster Turkish neutrality in November 1941. Turkey was supplied with planes from both the Allies and the Axis during World War II. The Tomahawk IIs were active in the Middle East from October of 1941 onward. They shared in the strafing of the retreating Axis troops. The ability of the Tomahawk to absorb an incredible amount of punishment became almost legendary. They also served with the South African Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force. At low altitudes, the Tomahawk II was actually superior to the Bf-109, but this advantage rapidly disappeared when combat took place at altitudes above 15,000 feet. The weight, which handicapped the performance of the Tomahawk, did have one tangible benefit. The rugged structure could absorb a terrific amount of battle damage and still allow the airplane to return to base. Although generally outclassed by the Bf-109, the Tomahawk was a capable fighter in the hands of experienced pilots. 150 P-40Fs were supplied to the RAF under Lend-Lease. The maximum speed of the P-40K was 320 miles per hour at 5,000 feet and 362 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. A climb to 15,000 feet took 7.5 minutes. Range was 350 miles with a 500-pound bomb attached. Ferry range was 1,600 miles. Weights were 6,400 pounds empty, 8,400 pounds gross, and 10,000 pounds maximum. By the summer of 1943, the performance of the P-40 Warhawk was leaving much to be desired, especially in comparison to later types, such as the P38, P47, and P51, which were coming into service. The P40N version was introduced at this time in an effort to improve the capabilities of the basic design and thus avoid interrupting Curtiss production lines by having the company introduce an entirely new type. A new lightweight structure was introduced. 2 of the 6 wing-mounted guns were removed. Smaller and lighter undercarriage wheels were installed. Head armor was reintroduced, and aluminum radiators and oil coolers were installed. On February 14, 1944, another 1,000 Warhawks were ordered. consisting of 500 N-30s and 500 N-35s. As late as June 30th, 1944, when the frontline equipment of all major air forces had far outpaced the potential of the P-40 series, an order for yet another 1,000 Warhawks was placed. This was the P-40N 40CU production block. However, this order was later cut back to 220 aircraft. The N-40 was powered by the V1710-115 engine of 1,360 horsepower and featured metal-covered ailerons. The N-40 variant dispensed with the camouflage finish. It included improved non-metallic self-sealing fuel tanks, new radio and oxygen equipment, and flame-damping exhausts. The last production Warhawk was a P-40N 40CU, which left the assembly line on November 30th, 1944. It was the 13,738th P-40 built. Many of the P-40Ns were shipped to Allied air forces under Lend-Lease and comprised the majority of the 1,097 P-40s sent to the USSR. Most of their operational flying took place in the Pacific in fighter, bomber, or escort roles. In U.S. Army Air Force service, the P-40N was relegated largely to training roles, as later types such as the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt became increasingly available in quantity. Although the RAF evaluated the P-40Ns in the United Kingdom, they were employed solely abroad. Most of the RAF Kitty Hawk IVs were phased out of service early in 1945, but one RAF squadron continued to operate the Kitty Hawk IV until the end of hostilities. These Kitty Hawk IVs were primarily operated in the Southwest Pacific campaigns as low-altitude fighter and ground attack aircraft. They were progressively replaced by Mustangs and Spitfires during the last year of the war, but the Kitty Hawks continued to serve with RAF squadrons until the end of hostilities. "172 P-40Ns were supplied to New Zealand. 35 P-40Ns were supplied to Canada. 41 P-40Ns were supplied to Brazil, where some served until 1958. An unspecified number were delivered to the Royal Netherlands East Indies Air Corps. They flew them against the Japanese in the latter stages of the war, then against the nationalist rebels in Indonesia until February of 1949. A large proportion of the 2,097 P-40s supplied to the Soviet Union were of the P-40N variety, but they were not very popular with the Russians, who considered them incapable of absorbing as much battle damage as the P-39 era Cobra. The P-40Q was an experimental project which attempted to produce a really modern fighter out of the existing P-40. The proposed production models of the P-40Q were to have carried either 6 .50-inch machine guns or 4 20mm cannons, but the XP-40Q was still inferior to contemporary production Mustangs and Thunderbolts, and development was therefore abandoned. Consequently, the production life of the P-40 ended with the N version. It was in Asia that the Warhawk was crucial at the beginning of the war. It was one of the few planes capable of fighting the Japanese. Still, their brave pilots could not stop the enemy onslaught. The Philippines fell. The United States was not yet geared up for war, but China was already fighting Japan. 100 RAF Tomahawks were released to China and served with the American volunteer group, AVG. the famous Flying Tigers. It is with the Flying Tigers that the P-40 achieved immortality. Newly promoted to Brigadier General in the Chinese Army, Claire Chennault went to the USA in November 1940 to recruit pilots for the AVG. General Chennault ordered 100 P-40s through a loan from the U.S. government. By the time of Pearl Harbor, some 80 American pilots were serving with the AVG, based at Kunming and Mingalagang. Contrary to popular understanding, the AVG did not actually enter combat until after Pearl Harbor. The famous shark's teeth marking did not originate with the Flying Tigers, but was copied from the markings used by the Tomahawks of the RAF's No. 112 Squadron in North Africa. The AVG drew first blood on December 20th, destroying 6 out of 10 attacking Japanese bombers. When the AVG encountered the Japanese Zero for the first time, they initially underestimated the maneuverability of their opponent, and they lost 2 pilots on December 23rd. It was soon learned that it was not wise to mix it up with the Zero on a 1-to-1 basis because of the inferior maneuverability and climb rate of the Curtiss, but instead to use the P-40's superior speed and diving ability to advantage. The most effective tactic against the Zero was a diving pass followed by a rapid departure from the scene. The P-40 gained a reputation for ruggedness, which enabled many an AVG pilot to return safely home after his plane was damaged in combat. The AVG in China had been working its P-40Cs, Tomahawk IIBs, pretty hard throughout January and February of 1942. Some were destroyed on the ground during Japanese strafing attacks, and others were lost in accidents. Cannibalization provided spares for those that could be kept airworthy. No more than 55 Curtiss fighters were available to the AVG at any one time. Without replacement, losses mounted rapidly, and the AVG was down to some 20 P-40Cs by March of 1942. That month, 30 P-40Es were transferred to China by air from Africa. The improved performance offered by these more potent P-40s was very useful against the Zero fighters, which were becoming more numerous in the Chinese theater. The AVG was absorbed into the U.S. Army Air Force as the 23rd Fighter Group on July 4th, 1942. At that time, it had been officially credited with the confirmed destruction of 286 Japanese aircraft, as against the loss of only 12 aircraft shot down, 8 pilots killed in action, and 4 missing. Most of the losses were on the ground, with 61 aircraft destroyed by Japanese strafing attacks or lost in accidents. The top-scoring AVG ace was Robert H. Neal, credited with 16 kills. 8 other pilots claimed 10 or more victories. The Flying Tigers accounted for more victories in proportion to their numbers than any other P-40 unit. By the end of the late 1940s, the P-40 had no role left. It might have been obsolete at the beginning of the war, but it had a lot of fight in it. By the time of the jet age, even a proven veteran like the Warhawk had no place. It was withdrawn from American service. The P-47 originated from the drawing board of Alexander Kartveli of the Seversky Aircraft Corporation, later renamed Republic Aviation. The Thunderbolt is consistently rated as one of the 3 outstanding U.S. Army Air Force fighters of World War II, rated right up there along with the North American P-51 Mustang and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-47, as originally conceived, was quite different from the aircraft which was ultimately to emerge from the Republic factories. On August 1, 1939, Kartveli, in response to an official requirement, proposed a lightweight, high-altitude interceptor to the U.S. Army Air Corps under the company designation of AP-10. It was to be powered by an 1,150 horsepower Allison V liquid-cooled inline engine. This was a radical change in design philosophy for Kartveli, since he had always preferred radial air-cooled engines for fighters because of their greater simplicity and their ability to absorb a greater amount of battle damage. Gross weight would be 4,900 pounds and estimated maximum speed 415 miles per hour. Armament was a pair of .50-inch machine guns mounted in the engine housing. The Air Corps looked over the proposal and was favorably impressed. However, they deemed that additional armament would be required, even if it adversely affected performance. Kartveli increased the size of his AP-10 design somewhat and added 4 wing-mounted .30-inch machine guns. Gross weight rose to 6,570 pounds. In this guise, in November 1939, the Air Corps ordered one prototype of the AP-10 design under the designation XP-47. In addition, on January 17, 1940, the Air Corps ordered a stripped, unarmed version under the designation XP-47A. In the meantime, combat reports coming in from Europe were changing everyone's ideas about air combat. More firepower, more armament, more armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks were likely to be required in future air battles. Both the XP-47 and XP-47A had insufficient engine power to accommodate the additional weight required by these features. And the Air Corps came to the conclusion that these designs were likely to fall far short of future air combat requirements. Kartveli went back to the drawing board. In order to accommodate the heavy firepower, armor, and self-sealing fuel tanks, and still provide a performance capable of meeting enemy aircraft on equal terms, a lot of engine horsepower would be needed. Kartveli decided to produce a design based around a turbo-supercharged Pratt & Whitney R2800 twin Wasp 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine, one of the most powerful aircraft engines available at the time. Armament was a set of 8 .50-inch machine guns in the wings, following the RAF's trend toward 8-gun fighters, and making the Republic proposal among the heaviest armed fighters yet considered by the Air Corps. Total weight was a massive 11,500 pounds, unprecedented for an Air Corps single-seat fighter. On June 12, 1940, Kartveli submitted his ideas to the Air Corps. The Air Corps was sufficiently impressed with the proposal. On September 6, 1940, it ordered a prototype under the designation XP-47B. This designation was sort of unusual at the time, namely using the same P number for what was, in effect, a totally new design. All work on the XP-47 and the XP-47A was canceled, and the serial number of the abortive XP-47 was transferred to the XP-47B. 1 week later, on September 13, 1940, 773 production examples of the Thunderbolt were ordered by the Air Corps, 171 to be delivered as P-47Bs, and 602 as P-47Cs. At the same time, the Army contract, placed back in 1939 for 80 P-44 rockets, was canceled. Cartveli decided to design the XP-47B fuselage around the large turbo supercharger from the start, rather than to add it onto the aircraft later. In order to preserve a streamlined fuselage with a small cross-section, the large turbo supercharger was placed in the rear fuselage. It was fed by an air duct located beneath the large R2800 engine. Engine exhaust gases were directed back to the rear fuselage in separate pipes to the turbine and were expelled through an exhaust under the rear tail. Ducted air was fed to a centrifugal impeller and was returned to the engine under pressure via an intercooler. Another problem that had to be solved was that the aircraft required a very large 12-foot diameter, 4-bladed propeller in order to fully take advantage of the R2800 engine's high power output. This large propeller, in turn, required a long and stocky undercarriage so that the propeller would have adequate ground clearance during takeoff and landing. If a conventional retractable undercarriage were used for the P-47, its suspension would have to have been placed very far outboard on the wings, leaving insufficient space for the 8 wing guns and their ammunition. In order to solve this problem, the landing gear telescoped and was 9 inches shorter when retracted than when extended. Somewhat surprisingly, this complex telescoping landing gear seems to have caused few problems in the field. Like the earlier P-35 and P-43 fighters, the P-47 was a cantilever low-wing monoplane, the wing being elliptical in shape, with the ailerons on the outer trailing edge and flaps on the inner trailing edge. The fuselage was all metal, but initially the control surfaces were fabric covered. The tail wheel was steerable and was fully retractable. All the fuel tanks were inside the fuselage and were self-sealing. The cockpit was protected by armor and was unpressurized. The XP-47B prototype flew for the first time on May 6, 1941, only 8 months after the order was placed. The XP-47B was the largest single-engine fighter built up to that time. On the first flight, the pilot was forced to make an emergency landing because exhaust fumes leaked into the cockpit. At a loaded weight of 12,086 pounds, the XP-47B dwarfed all previous fighters, being almost twice as heavy as most of its contemporaries. Its 18-cylinder radial engine offered 1,960 horsepower at 25,800 feet and gave it a maximum speed of 412 miles per hour, 12 miles per hour faster than Cartveli had projected. An altitude of 15,000 feet could be attained in 5 minutes. The prototype was destroyed in an accident on August 8, 1942. At one time, it had been hoped that it would be possible for the RAF to test the Thunderbolt in combat in the Middle East. But production difficulties caused the British Air Ministry to be informed in September 1941 that it was probably not a good idea to do this until all the bugs had been wrung out of the design. The first production P-47B was delivered on December 21, 1941, and 5 more were delivered in March 1942, only 8 months after the XP-47B had first flown. The P-47D was the first version of the Thunderbolt to undergo really large-scale production. The first U.S. Army Air Force order for the P-47D took place on October 14, 1941, when 850 were ordered. However, it was to be followed by many, many more. Toward the end of 1943, 8th Air Force Thunderbolts began returning from escort missions over the continent on the deck, seeking out enemy ground targets of opportunity for their unused ammunition. Somewhat surprisingly, it was found that the Thunderbolt was rather well suited for this new role. This led to perhaps the most successful adaptation of the Thunderbolt as a fighter bomber. The P-47 went to war. Its first operational sorties began on March 10, 1943, and consisted of high-altitude escort duties and fighter sweeps. The first encounter with German fighters came on April 15th, when P-47Cs of the 335th Squadron shot down 3 German fighters with a loss of 3 of its own. The high-altitude performance of the P-47C was far superior to anything the Luftwaffe could put up against it, but at low and medium altitudes, the P-47C could not match the maneuverability and climb rates of its opponents. However, the P-47C could outdive just about anything in the sky, and many a Thunderbolt saved itself from a sticky situation by using its superior diving performance to break off combat. The Thunderbolt could outroll any other fighter. The Thunderbolt's 8.50-inch machine guns provided sufficient firepower to destroy any enemy plane which had the misfortune to come within its sights. The robust construction of the Thunderbolt enabled it to absorb a considerable amount of battle damage and still stagger home. The P-47Cs of the 56th, 4th, and 78th Groups of the 8th Air Force were intended as bomber escorts, but were ineffective until July 1943, when they were fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks to lengthen their range. P-47s flew escort missions until the end of 1943. Longer-range P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs, which were better suited for a long-range escort role, started to replace them. Once the Mustang began to take over, the Thunderbolt was largely diverted into the ground attack role. After seeing action in North Africa, the 9th Air Force was transferred to England as part of the buildup for D-Day. These units provided much effective ground support for the advancing Allied forces as they penetrated further and further into France. The Thunderbolt, with its heavy machine gun armament and its heavy load of bombs and rockets, was extremely effective in eliminating enemy forces in the face of the Allied advance. The P-47D continued to rack up an impressive number of air-to-air kills against the Luftwaffe, while it beat up the Wehrmacht on the ground during its destructive bombing and strafing career. The Thunderbolt also saw service in Italy. The 325th Group of the 15th Air Force, flying P-47Cs, saw action at Foggia from December 1943 onward. P-47Ds were flown by groups of the 12th Air Force. One of the less well-known operators of the P-47D Thunderbolt was the first group of the Brazilian Air Force. Brazil had declared war on Germany and Italy on August 22, 1942. And this group was attached to the 350th Group of the 12th Air Force. It is not widely known, but the Brazilian Air Force participated in combat on the Allied side of the Italian front in 1944. A squadron of P-47Ds, operated by Brazilian Air Force pilots, was attached to the U.S. 12th Air Force and went into action for the first time on November 11, 1944. Before the end of the war, the Brazilian Air Force had received 88 P-47Ds. Many pilots became aces while flying the Thunderbolt. Outstanding among these was Lieutenant Colonel Francis S. Gabreski, with 31 kills, the highest scoring Thunderbolt pilot. Captain Robert S. Johnson with 28 kills, and Colonel Hubert Zemke with 20 kills. The highest scoring U.S. Army Air Force group in Europe was the 56th Fighter Group, which destroyed 1,006 German aircraft against a loss of 128 Thunderbolts, a ratio of nearly 8-to-1. At one time during the heady days of 1944, there were no less than 31 frontline fighter groups flying Thunderbolts. Thunderbolts fought on all fronts in World War II, including Alaska. Approximately 2/3 of all Thunderbolts built actually reached operational units overseas. In 2.5 years of combat, from March 1943 to August 1945, these Thunderbolts flew over 500,000 combat missions, destroying over 12,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. A total of 5,222 Thunderbolts were lost, 824 of them in the heat of combat. This was 54% of the Thunderbolts being lost either to enemy action or to accidents, which was a fairly typical attrition rate for a wartime fighter. Losses of Thunderbolts on operational missions were 0.7% of those dispatched, an exceptionally low figure. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had established an overall victory-to-loss ratio of 4.6-to-1. Thunderbolts dropped 132,482 tons of bombs, fired 59,567 rockets, and expended 135 million belts of machine gun ammunition. From D-Day to VE Day in Europe, Thunderbolts destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles and tanks, and 68,000 trucks. By the end of the war, Thunderbolts had destroyed 2,752 enemy aircraft in the air and 3,315 on the ground. The P47N version of the Thunderbolt was the last version to be manufactured in quantity. It was a specialized long-range version built specifically for service in the Pacific Theater. However, the war in the Pacific required fighter ranges even greater than did operations over Germany. In pursuit of better long-range performance, in mid-1944, the third YP-47M prototype was fitted with a new wet wing of slightly larger span and area. The aircraft was redesignated XP-47N. For the first time in the Thunderbolt series, fuel was carried in the wings, a 93 U.S. gallon tank being fitted in each wing. When maximum external tankage was carried, this brought the total fuel load of the XP-47N up to an impressive 1,266 U.S. gallons. This load made possible a range of 2,350 miles. The new wing also incorporated larger ailerons and squared-off wingtips. These innovations enhanced the roll rate of the Thunderbolt and improved the maneuverability. The dorsal fin behind the bubble canopy was somewhat larger than on the P-47D. However, the increased fuel load increased the gross weight of the aircraft. In order to cope with the increased gross weight, the undercarriage of the XP-47N had to be strengthened, which increased the weight still further. The maximum weight rose to over 20,000 pounds. The XP-47N flew for the first time on July 22, 1944. Such was the U.S. Army Air Force confidence in the Thunderbolt design that they went ahead and ordered 1,900 P-47Ns on June 20, 1944, even before the first XP-47N had flown. P47N was destined to be the last version of the Thunderbolt to be manufactured. The first P47N1RE appeared in September of 1944, and 24 were delivered by year's end. The P47N5RE and subsequent batches had zero-length rocket launchers added. The R2877 engine was installed in late production models, such as the P47N25RE. The P47N gave excellent service in the Pacific in the last year of the war, particularly in escorting B-29 Super Fortress bombers in raids on the Japanese mainland. P47Ns were able to escort the bombers all the way from Saipan to Japan and on many other long overwater flights. The first P-47Ds to arrive in the Pacific Theater entered service with the 48th Fighter Group of the 5th Air Force in June of 1943. They were initially operated out of Australia and were used on long-range missions to strike at Japanese targets in New Guinea. Soon after Saipan and Guam were taken, the 318th Group and the 508th Group of the 7th Air Force saw action in June 1944, having been the first to take delivery of the P-47N long-range version. They were followed by the 20th Air Force on Okinawa, readying for the final assault on Japan. The war in Europe took precedence over the conflict in the Pacific, and it was not until April of 1944 that the first P-47s reached the China-Burma-India theater. They initially equipped the 33rd, 81st, and 80th Fighter Groups, as well as the 5th and 6th Fighter Command Squadrons of the 10th and 14th Air Forces. They were joined by Thunderbolt I and II aircraft of the RAF. However, many of these late arrivals were not in time to see any action. One of the first RAF squadrons to see action was the 5th Squadron, which was based in Burma and which had previously flown Mohawks and Hurricanes. They flew patrols under the direction of visual ground posts and caused tremendous damage among Japanese troops and supply lines. The Thunderbolt served in the U.S. Air Force until 1955. It would serve in other air forces well into the 1960s, its power slowly overshadowed by the big jets of the era. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was the main shipboard fighter of the U.S. Navy for the last 2 years of the Pacific War. During the Gilbert and Marshall operations, the raid on Truk, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and at Leyte Gulf, the entire fighter complement of the fast carrier force consisted of F-6Fs. At Leyte Gulf as Task Force 38, the carrier force was equipped with nearly 550 fighters, all of them Hellcats. This illustrates the astounding degree of standardization achieved in the American frontline forces, something made possible only by the vast output of U.S. industry. The F-6F was ordered for the U.S. Navy after the initial shock of Allied contact with superior Japanese fighters, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M-0. As a result of the experience of combat against much higher performance machines, the F-6F specification required the most powerful engine available. The prototype X-6F1, a progression from the F-4F Wildcat, which was then the standard fighter of the Navy, was provided with a 1,700 horsepower Wright R2600 engine. But a month later, On 26 June 1942, it was re-engined with a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800. The birth of the F-6F coincided almost exactly with the Great Carrier Battle of Midway, June 4th through 6th, 1942, in which its predecessor, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, played a critical role. Production F-6F-3s made their first combat flights on 31 August and 1 September 1943 from the carriers Yorktown, Essex, and the light carrier Independence. The Hellcat immediately outclassed its opponents, having higher speed and rate of climb, being rugged and well armored, but at the same time very maneuverable for such a large machine, and carrying a heavy and effective armament of 6 .5-inch Browning machine guns and a large ammunition supply. The arrival of the F-6Fs in late 1943, combined with the deployment of the new Essex and Independence-class carriers, gave the U.S. Pacific Fleet immediate and overwhelming air superiority wherever its fast carriers operated. A total of 2,545 Hellcats were delivered in 1943. In 1944, 6,139. And in 1945, 3,578, bringing total production to 12,272. The Hellcat was eventually credited with destroying more than 6,000 Japanese aircraft, 4,947 of these by F-6Fs of the Navy carrier squadrons, 209 of the others by land-based Marine Corps F-6Fs, and the remainder by Hellcats of other Allied countries. The F-6F's most spectacular exploit was the destruction of more than 160 enemy aircraft in one day, 19 June 1944, in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, in an aerial massacre known grimly as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The F-6F was also used extensively as a search aircraft and fighter bomber, playing a major and increasing role in strikes on Japanese warships and mercantile shipping in 1944 and 45. In this role, and for ground attack, it could carry up to 2,000 pounds of bombs or be armed with 6 5-inch rockets on underwing pylons. Its maximum speed was 376 miles per hour at an initial climb of 3,240 feet per minute. Its service ceiling was 37,500 feet and had a range of 1,090 miles. The Hellcat was prominent in two main battles in the Pacific, the Battle for the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 and the Battle for Leyte Gulf in October 1944. In December 1941, within hours of the destruction of the United States Pacific Battle Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces began their assault on the Philippines. In April 1942, the Bataan Peninsula fell, and in May, General Wainwright and the bulk of the remaining U.S. and Filipino forces were forced to surrender at Corregidor. 2.5 years after the fall of Bataan, U.S. and Allied forces began the reconquest of the Philippines with major landings on the island of Leyte. In those 2.5 years, the Japanese had suffered a catalog of defeats, beginning in June 1942 with the Pacific War's most decisive battle, the Battle of Midway. At Midway, the Japanese Navy lost 4 of its 6 large aircraft carriers, the 6 which had made the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, along with all their aircraft and many of their aircrew. This and the 3 other carrier battles in 1942, Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, deprived the Japanese Navy of most of its trained carrier aircrew, disastrous losses which it was never able to replace. Four months before the Leyte landings at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese fleet made its final major effort with carrier-borne aircraft to defeat the American Navy. The Imperial Japanese Navy sent 9 aircraft carriers with 473 aircraft into the battle. But their aircrew were so poorly trained and the U.S. equipment so superior that the Japanese air groups were massacred in their attacks on the U.S. fleet. Nearly 200 of their aircraft were shot down over or near Task Force 58, the fast carrier force, in a single afternoon. In addition to this, 3 Japanese carriers were sunk in the battle, and the Japanese lost nearly 500 carrier and land-based aircraft in 2 days. Of the hundreds of U.S. aircraft engaged in this great battle, only 23 were shot down, and 6 more lost operationally. Task Force 58 lost 29 aircrew and suffered 31 fatalities on the ships which were hit or near missed. In very few battles since medieval times, whether on land or at sea, have losses been so one-sided. The 2-day engagement had been the largest pure carrier versus carrier battle in history and was to be the last. The immediate consequence of the Japanese defeat was the U.S. capture of the Marianas. This broke the Japanese inner line of defense and meant that American bombers based on the islands could now reach targets on Japan itself. As As a result of their huge losses of aircrew in the battle, the remnants of the Japanese seaborne air groups were never again able to challenge the American fleet. And at the Leyte Gulf 4 months later, the Japanese carrier force, which had once dominated the Pacific War, was reduced to playing the role of decoy, while the primary attacking role was, of necessity, assigned to the Imperial Navy's battleships and their attendant cruisers and destroyers. As a result of the devastation of their air groups, the Japanese carriers, which at the outset of the Pacific War had been the spearhead of the Japanese offensive, were reduced by the time of the Leyte campaign to the role of decoys, and the task of making the real attacks on the U.S. invasion fleet was of necessity left to the Imperial Japanese Navy battleship and heavy cruiser forces, which were still largely intact, and to what land-based air power the Japanese could still muster. The Japanese command knew that if the Philippines were lost, then the war was also lost. They therefore drew up a desperate plan which risked their remaining surface forces, but offered them a remote chance of destroying the American invasion fleet and isolating the Allied ground forces on Leyte. Like many previous Japanese operational plans, it depended on the use of a decoy force. The Japanese carriers were now all but impotent for lack of trained air crew, and were therefore the ships selected to play the most important decoy role. Vice Admiral Ozawa, with 4 aircraft carriers and a dozen other ships, would come down from the north and draw off the main American covering forces. Meanwhile, 2 powerful battleship forces would penetrate the central Philippines and then converge on the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. The southernmost of these, commanded by Rear Admiral Nishimura, would penetrate through Surigao Strait, just south of Leyte. The more powerful of the two battleship forces, the Central Force under the command of Vice Admiral Kurita, contained 5 battleships, including the giant Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships in the world, 10 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers. It was intended to penetrate San Bernardino Strait, sail down the coast of Samar, and fall on the American invasion fleet from the northeast. The landing forces for the Leyte operation were organized under Vice Admiral Kincaid's 7th Fleet. This consisted of 738 vessels of many different types, including a powerful force of cruisers and old slow battleships, as well as a large number of destroyers. 7th Fleet was intended to be covered and supported by U.S. 3rd Fleet under Admiral Halsey. Halsey's fleet came under Admiral Nimitz's Central Pacific Command, while the 7th Fleet came under General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Forces. Thus, there was no overall naval commander during the campaign, which almost inevitably led to great confusion in the forthcoming battle, and in the event almost led to a strategic disaster for the Allies. Less than 10 minutes later, he received the astounding report that the 7th Fleet's escort carriers had been surprised by the Japanese main force off Samar, were under heavy attack, and that the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf was in great danger. Seventh Fleet contained a large task group of 18 escort carriers divided into 3 task units of 6 carriers each. The main duties of these ships were the provision of combat air patrol over the Leyte beachhead and the invasion shipping ground attack on Leyte and anti-submarine patrol. They and their air groups were not trained or equipped to fight an enemy fleet. But the great battle had been joined. At about 23:10, the U.S. submarine Jalao torpedoed and sank the light cruiser Tama of Ozawa's force. This was effectively the end of the battle for Cape Vigano and of the battles for Leyte Gulf. The U.S. had lost 1 light carrier and 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 1 large carrier, the Zuikaku, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships including the giant Musashi, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Major General J.F.C. Fuller, in his book, The Decisive Battles of the Western World, writes of this outcome, "The Japanese fleet had effectively ceased to exist, and except by land-based aircraft, their opponents had won undisputed command of the sea." When Admiral Ozawa was questioned on the battle after the war, he replied, "After this battle, the surface forces became strictly auxiliary, so that we relied on land force, special kamikaze attack, and air power. There was no further use assigned to surface vessels with the exception of some special ships." And Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister, said that he realized that the defeat at Leyte was tantamount to loss of the Philippines. As for the larger significance of the battle, he said, "I felt that this was the end." The Hellcat had played a decisive role in these battles. Production of the aircraft ended in 1945. The Hellcat had become quickly obsolete in the fast-changing world of aircraft design prompted by the war. Still, it had performed magnificently in the Pacific War. It had a right to be proud.